Welcome to Malmö University and to this guest lecture with Maud Barlow from the Council of Canadians. My name is Fredrik Björk. I'm a lecturer in environmental science at the Department of Urban Studies here at Malmö University. And this lecture is arranged as an open lecture, but also as an extracurricular activity for the students of our international master's program called Leadership for Sustainability. And we are arranging this lecture in collaboration with Jordens Vänner, Friends of the Earth Sweden, and with an organization called Corporate Europe Observatory. And we hope that this lecture will bring on interesting insights and provide a more informed debate about issues of international trade and international trade agreements and the relationship to sustainability.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Ellie. I'm active with Friends of the Earth in Sweden, based in Malmö. I'm very happy to be here and very happy to have Maud Barlow here, international guest from Canada. The trade debate in Sweden has not been very loud, I should say, and most of all the trade agreement between Canada and the EU has not been discussed at all, CETA. So this is one of our activities to try and change that, to get up the debate. So let me introduce Maud Barlow, and after that I'll give the floor to her. Maud is the national chairperson of the Council of Canadians, and she also chairs the board of the Food and Water Watch in Washington. She's a board member of the International Forum on Globalization, and she's also a counselor with the World Future Council, which is based in Hamburg. She is the recipient of 14 honorary doctorates, as well as many awards, including the Right Livelihood Award in 2005, which was issued in Sweden. It has a strong connection to it. Could someone open the door, please? Thank you. She also served as a senior advisor on water to the 63rd President of the United Nations General Assembly, and was a leader in the campaign to have water recognized as a human right by the United Nations, campaign that was ongoing a couple of years ago. She's the author of dozens of reports and books, including Blue Future, Protecting Water for People and the Planet Forever, and Boiling Point, Government Neglect, Corporate Abuse, and Canada's Water Crisis. She's with the Council of Canadians, as Fredrik already said, and Council of Canadians is working on issues such as trade, climate, democracy, and most notably on NAFTA and CETA at the moment, at least. That's one of the major issues for us today. So with that, big welcome to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, and thank you for your kind welcome, and I'm just really pleased to be here. I will talk at you for a little while, and then I really hope we can have a conversation. So my understanding is that some of you guys are really kind of into the TTIP-CETA issue, and some are not so much. So I'm going to do a little background and try to talk about trade from a perspective that maybe some of you haven't heard. I know that in a lot of universities you get a kind of trade 101, which is trade is always good, creates lots of wonderful jobs, and all that's going to keep happening, right? I don't know why it's locked. It's good. It's so I'm going to tell you a little bit of history about trade. We're a trading nation, my country. You're a trading nation. I want to start off saying I'm not against trade. Okay? I'm very much pro-trade. And in fact, I have no problem with traditional trade agreements that tend to take down tariff barriers in areas that are mutually beneficial to both parties, right? I want you to understand that the current kind of trade agreements and investment agreements that are being negotiated, like a TTIP, There's it over here, which is the one with the United States. Oh my God. How do you put up with that? As a lecturer, you just do, right? You just keep going. No problem. We can't leave it open? No. It closes by itself. All right, never mind.
I think the problem is only here because in other rooms it's not like
Okay. So, we're good, right? Is that closed or somebody else want in?
Don't worry, no.
I think I'll stand over here
You're
for a
going to
while.
stand. Just for a minute, baby. Thank you so much. I'll just try not to worry about it. So I'm not sure I'm going to block this. Thank you, my dear.
My apologies.
No, don't you dare apologize. So, the current spate of agreements, like the transatlantic agreement between the EU and the United States, and CETA, the one I want to talk to you most about, which is the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, are very, very different than traditional trade agreements. Traditional trade agreements, as I say, were about goods, trading goods, and taking down tariffs so that if country A produces more and better whatever of this kind, and country B produces something different, that you exchange. And that's fine, okay, but what we've got in the current spate of the trade agreements is basically a system where they're going after what they call non-tariff barriers. Most of the barriers between North America and Europe are already taken down, and they can always be negotiated on one-on-one. It's a continuous kind of process. These agreements are established to allow large corporations, particularly transnational corporations and transnational capital, to establish ways to limit the space of government. And I'll explain to you what I mean, how that happens. But basically, they want governments to have less ability to be able to set standards that are too high for them to make a profit. And what they want is what they call a level playing field, so that as they go from country to country, and these are corporations that are transnational. They may have started in one country, but they don't think that way anymore. They think globally, and they don't want to bump into different standards as they go from one country to another. And they want those standards to be even, and they want them to be the lowest possible standards, because then they get to make more money. And it's very, very clear what their agenda is. They're pretty open about it. And so they're the ones that are backing the big corporate service lobbies, the big corporate energy lobbies, the big agribusiness lobbies, the big chemical industry lobbies. These are the ones that are behind these trade agreements, and they basically are the ones that introduce them to governments. Now, we had the first of these type of agreements in the world, basically, started in Canada and the United States back in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was the president of the United States. And Canadians were really worried that Ronald Reagan's United States was going to become, we were going to become like it, and we were going to lose our social security. We had higher standards on the environment, we had higher labor standards, and we had higher environmental and health and safety standards in the United States. And so we were nervous, and we had a reason to be nervous, it turns out. So that agreement was signed in 1989, and then they went on to make NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which then went on to include Mexico. Now, because it was including Mexico, the countries of Canada and the United States and their corporations were worried that, well, what if Mexico doesn't honor this agreement? So they brought in the first time for industrialized countries, something called ISDS, Investor State Dispute Settlement. And you guys need to learn about this. If you don't know about it, it's absolutely crucial to the work you're doing if you care about the environment, if you care about health and safety or human rights. Because in the past, under a trade agreement, if an industry in one country had a problem, they think they're being treated unfairly in another country, they would have to get their government to lodge a complaint with the other government, and then it would be discussed and negotiated government to government. But for the very first time in the North American Free Trade Agreement, a corporation is able to challenge another government directly. If that government brings in a new law, or if that government changes its law, improves the law, or it even interprets a law in a way that this company feels is unfair, they can sue for compensation, and your domestic companies cannot. So it is not as if you're saying, okay, we've got a trade agreement and we're going to give the corporations from your country the same rights as are corporations, you're actually giving them huge new rights, the right to sue if you bring in laws that they don't like. The very first case ever was a case from a company called Ethel, and this was a company in the United States that sold a gasoline additive called MMT, which has been banned in Europe for years, decades, right? It was banned back in the 1990s when this first challenge came along. And it was banned in many states. California had banned it, but we had it in Canada. And some research told our government that it was a carcinogen, cancerous, cancer-causing agent. And our Prime Minister at the time actually got up in our Parliament and said it is carcinogenic, that is dangerous, particularly to children, and we're going to ban it. So we banned it. And you would think a government would have the right to ban a chemical or an additive in gasoline that's proven to be carcinogen, right? So under this ISDS provision in NAFTA, the companies sued our government. And not only did our government give in because we lost the case, and then so if you lose the case, you have a choice. You can either pay financially for your right to regulate, or you have to change your law. So what our cowardly government did was say, oh, we're sorry, okay, you can sell your additive MMT in our gas again. And we had to pay them millions of dollars for the lost profit they made in the 1 year between when they first launched the challenge, or when we brought in the ban and when the ban was lifted. We had to give them a letter saying that we were sorry, and that it's actually a wonderful product, and it's totally safe, and our Prime Minister shouldn't have said such a thing. Now, I'm not making this up, okay? That was the first of many, many cases. So Canadians have a real story to tell you guys in Europe. When you look at having a deal that includes investor state ISDS in it, like TTIP and CETA, when you have agreements like this, this is what you're going to live with. We have now had 39 cases like that against us by American corporations who don't like our higher standards. And Mexico's had something like, I think it's 35 cases against them. You'll be interested to know we've lost a whole bunch and paid out millions of dollars. Mexico has lost a whole bunch and paid out millions and millions of pesos. The United States has never lost one. So on paper, these agreements tend to look equal, right? They tend to look pretty good. But in fact, when you're dealing with a superpower, they just kind of somehow always get their way. There is one very interesting one now. You will have read about Keystone Pipeline. This is the pipeline that we wanted to build. We have, Alberta, there's Canada. Second province in is a huge province called Alberta, and we have a lot of energy locked in what's called the tar sands. And this is heavy, thick, gooey, tarry looking stuff. And so it's not conventional oil. To get the oil out of it, you have to use a lot of hot water to steam blast it up. Destroys water, it uses it gives off way more greenhouse gas emissions. We're trying very hard to stop the expansion of these tar sands. You should read about them. It's really an incredible story. We call them Canada's Mordor, right? This is Canada's, this is hell, right? And the First Nations people living downstream have all sorts of cancers. I mean, it's been directly linked to the chemicals that are being released from this process. So we're trying to stop it. But they can't refine it fast enough. We don't have enough refineries in Alberta, so they wanted to build this pipeline called Keystone. It's a big company called TransCanada, and they wanted to build it down through the United States over the Ogallala Aquifer, which is their most important aquifer and is being depleted right now for corn production, for corn ethanol. That's another story. And they wanted to send it down to refineries in Texas. So it was a huge issue. You probably read about it. And the people saying yes, and other people saying no, and the people in the Dakotas and anywhere and Nebraska where the pipeline was going to go through, saying it's not coming through here, we'll put our lives on the line. It was really hot. Finally, President Obama, about a year ago, not quite a year ago, said no, it's not going to happen on my watch. It's got to go back to the drawing board. A new president would have to start the environmental process all over again. So it was a huge win for our movement, right? 350.org was very involved, Friends of the Earth, Greenpeace, all the groups were very involved in this. So what did TransCanada do? It turned around and it's launched a NAFTA Chapter 11 ISDS challenge against the United States government for $500 million. Now we'll see. This might be the first one the Americans lose, and we're all hoping they lose because we want the American government to learn what it feels like when you have to pay out money. And at the moment, Canada is still facing 135 billion euros of challenges from American corporations mostly for environmental rules on our side that they don't like. I'll give you some examples. The province of Quebec put a moratorium on fracking, shale gas fracking, and you guys, environmentalists, you know about fracking. It's a huge anti-fracking movement in Canada now and in the United States and growing in Europe. But an American company called Lone Pine, that actually it's a Canadian company. This is really interesting. So technically a Canadian company can't challenge, but they have a subsidiary in the United States. So they're challenging us for I think it's something like $350 million for that, from their subsidiary in the United States. And these companies country hop. They'll look and see what country has an investment agreement with another country, and they'll country hop. So even though it's a Canadian company, it's using its American subsidiary to challenge us against Quebec's right to have a moratorium on fracking. And, there's typical. There's another where there was a big quarry in a very delicate estuary on the east coast, which would have destroyed the local fisheries and harmed the whales. The environmental panel, the federal environmental panel said, no, you must not allow this, so it was banned. But the company had already put money into exploration, so they sued us, and we lost. We lost that case. I mean, how can we lose a case like that? It's our right to interpret our law in our way, and we're going to have to pay them something like $250 million. It's insane. So this is what ISDS is. It's the right of a foreign company to get access to what they consider a standstill provision. In other words, when they arrive in your country, if you're allowing bad practices and they're making money from that bad practice and then you want to change your mind, you can change your mind, but you have to be prepared to pay them. Or don't regulate. Those are your two options. You either don't regulate, you give up the right to regulate, or you turn around and you have to pay for it. Now let me tell you, since NAFTA, all right, there are almost 3,500 bilateral investment treaties that have these exact provisions in them, ISDS provisions. So we have companies like big cigarette companies sued Australia for millions and millions of dollars because they put their cigarettes in plain packaging. And again, you'd think our country would have a right to make that decision. There's another Canadian gold company that's suing and won this one, a huge suit. That's two, one in Nicaragua and one in El Salvador, because our gold mining companies from Canada are in there destroying their water. And when they start to understand what these companies are doing, they say, no more expansion. But the companies say, but we came in here, the former government told us we could have all the water we wanted. Former government told us we could do whatever, we could expand. So if you tell us you're going to stop, just because you're running out of water, how dare you, right? If your children are getting sick because we're poisoning your water, did you see the news last night with the river in Russia that turned bright red? Anyway, that's what these mines do. And if you try to stop them, and there's an investor state right that they have because there's been one of these investment agreements, they can sue you, and they're suing these poor countries. One suit that Nicaragua lost was so big it was the equal of the entire budget for health care for their entire population for a year. Because they said, they put to the International Court of Dispute Settlement, they said, do you understand what you're doing to us? Giving this company this kind of settlement, you're destroying our ability to give our people health care and education. So it's bad enough between rich countries. It's really bad between big corporations and poor countries. And it's really bad for the environment. And I want to stress to you what these companies go after are higher labor standards, higher environmental and higher health and safety standards. They don't want chemicals banned. Obviously, if you're a chemical company, it's in their benefit for there to be as few bans or as few countries banning the chemicals they produce. And in our country, and you need to know this going into this discussion of CETA, that we have lowered our standards because of NAFTA in terms of chemicals, in terms of food production. We used to have a very safe way of producing food. more like Europe, very big organic food. We've moved now to a production that's based on cheap food, export-oriented production, and mass production in factory farms. We have much lower standards on animal welfare than you do. We have much lower standards on cleaning chickens. We allow them to be cleaned in chlorinated chemicals, like the United States does. We took our standards, moved down to theirs. So if you don't like the American standards on GMOs or anything else, you're not going to like what happened in Canada, because it's going to be the same thing. I promise we'll have lots of time to discuss it. So that brings me to these two agreements. So your governments, through the European Union, and our government and the United States government have been negotiating a similar treaty to NAFTA since 2008. Actually, they started the Canada one in 2008. They started the US TTIP one a few years later. TTIP has become so unpopular. There's such a movement against it. There was a poll in Germany, only 17% of Germans want TTIP. And people know about it in Germany. It's a really hot issue. Only a third of people in France want TTIP and CETA. So as people are learning about it, it's becoming very hot, as a hot potato. And recently, both very important politicians in Germany and France and Austria said they don't want TTIP and it's dead. So this means that we really need to be thinking about CETA. So let me tell you a little bit about these agreements, and then I'll open it up for lots of discussion. CETA and TTIP are like NAFTA, only worse, okay? So both of them have the same investor-state provision of protecting corporations. And let me tell you, the American companies like Monsanto, the big chemical companies in the United States, the big agribusiness companies, the big oil companies, all will use these two agreements, and I'll tell you how in a minute, how they can use NAFTA or CETA. They want to use these agreements to challenge the fact that you have higher standards on food safety and environmental regulations here in Europe. And they're open about it. Monsanto has said this openly. That's what these agreements are for, and that's how they're going to use them. So that means if there's a new chemical that comes onto the market, instead of the precautionary principle where they have to prove that it's safe before you allow it forward, you're going to start moving to risk assessment. And the risk assessment, this is an actual term that's used. Risk assessment, the government looks at it and says, okay, it hasn't been proven safe, so we have to think about that. But the company is already selling that product in here, or we haven't banned it yet. And so the company is saying, if you do ban it, that's a new rule that wasn't in place when we established our presence here. So if you do ban it, you're going to have to pay this company a lot of money. And also they're going to lose money, and they're going to be angry with you, and they may take your business elsewhere. So the risk assessment is that you're now balancing the health and safety and environmental risk of this new product against these corporate interests. And that's very different than the precautionary principle. The precautionary principle says that the onus is on the producer to show, the industry producer to demonstrate that it is absolutely safe before you allow it to market. So we have, as I say, through NAFTA, we have lowered and lowered and lowered our standards. And so a corporation from North America, a mining company from Canada, pulp and paper companies come in here, any of them can come in here and challenge higher European standards just the way the United States challenged higher Canadian standards. And I'm telling you this because we lived through it, okay? We lived through it. And anybody who tells you it's going to be lots of jobs, that's a bunch of bullshit, excuse me. It's, these people say, oh, this, more corporate power and leave the market to make decisions and deregulation so it's easier for all these companies to operate, and privatization, this is all good. Well, then how do they explain it? This is so good for the world. Why is it that 3/4 of the world's working age population doesn't have secure employment? They're now called the precariat. It's actually a term used by the UN to explain that, or to describe that 3/4 of the world's population of working age doesn't have decent jobs. They don't have benefits, they don't have security. Many young people are working in 2 or 3 jobs. I remember being in a conference when George Bush was in power, and somebody said, "Oh, President Bush has created lots of jobs. I myself have 3 of them." This is the new world. So if they tell you, "Oh, it's great for jobs," we were telling you earlier that you were taking a class where a prof said it's great for jobs. It's not great for jobs. It's great for jobs at the very top. These agreements are meant for the 1% or the top 10% or whatever. And some people make a great deal of money, and that's the other thing that happened in our country, is that the wages of workers stayed stagnant and the amount of money being made by corporations and CEOs just went through the roof. And we've divided in our country into a have and have not country, not quite as extreme as the United States, but really something we could never have imagined in our country. Okay, so these agreements, so both TTIP and CETA have the ability for corporations from North America to challenge your higher standards. And either you give up those higher standards or you have to pay compensation, potentially billions of euros of compensation. Both these agreements have something new that was not in NAFTA, and it therefore make them worse than NAFTA, and it's called regulatory cooperation. And regulatory cooperation means that you agree, the parties, they call them the parties, Europe and North America agree, that any industry sector that wants to start a process to harmonize all the standards between Europe and North America has the right to do so. It's written right in the body of the agreement. That's not been in any other trade agreement before. This is new. And so, again, I go back to Monsanto. Say TTIP or CETA are signed in a year. Monsanto says, okay, we've waited a year. Now we want to go after the GMOs, GMO bans in Europe. So we're going to set up an industry panel, and it does not come to your legislatures, and will not go to your parliament. These are separate bodies that meet, and they will have bureaucrats from Europe and North America. They'll have industry sector people from Monsanto and other companies like it, and they'll have trade experts. And they will all sit down together and they'll negotiate behind closed doors, and you won't know any of what's going on, and the rules will get harmonized so that Monsanto doesn't have different rules in Europe than it has in North America. And I promise you, they may not go as low as the American standards, but they will not be what you have now, because that's not the point of these trade agreements. All regulation. And you're going to hear your government say, oh, but we're allowed to maintain the right to regulate. Yeah, but if you bring in any improvement in that regulation, you have to pay compensation. But even the right to regulate says it cannot be trade restricted. You cannot, so even your right to regulate has to be regulated by being friendly, trade friendly to these companies from other countries, right? So that's the second thing that's important. The third thing, and this is also new in CETA and TTIP, is that these rules apply to local governments, okay? So for the first time, all the money that's spent on health and education and water systems and so on, all of that is now applies to what your municipalities and your local states and provinces spend, not just federal spending. So that's the mother lode, if you will, of spending is that local spending. So it's going to be very difficult for a community to say, okay, we want to develop locally, we want local economic development plans, a big plant moved out and people are unemployed, you get together and you build together, or you want to give preference to local organic food in your schools and hospitals. All of that can be challenged because that's an unfair barrier to foreign trade, to those who might want to come in, the big food service companies who want to come in and don't want you doing that kind of thing. The fourth thing, and that's so wrong with CETA and TTIP, is something called the standstill and ratchet clause, and these are in all of the agreements. And these mean that, okay, you can protect a public service as it exists now, except this one's called the negative list, so you better put every part of that public service in there when you say you want to protect it. But if a municipality decides to try privatization, say it privatizes a hospital, or say it decides to privatize a water service, which is a big issue all over Europe, all over the world actually, but then they say 5 years later, wow, that was a mistake. that company is making money and the water prices, the water bills went up and the quality isn't good. And this is the story of water privatization around the world. So that municipality wants to go back to a public system. You cannot do that. It's called ratchet and standstill. And what it means is that you have agreed. The standstill basically says that when you liberalize, that's the term they use, and commercialize, it means commercialize or privatize. When you liberalize a public service, it stands still there. That's where it stands. It's part of the market. You can't take it back. So when they say they have the right to regulate, it is not true. Okay, and this is really important for you to know so that you are challenging this information. So TTIP, so what the situation is now, TTIP is on the back burner because trade is a very hot issue in the United States election, as you probably know, and not just Trump. Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton have all said no to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and they wouldn't touch this for years, I promise you. And also it's really unpopular in Europe. So that brings us to CETA. CETA is coming up really soon. They've been negotiating it for 8 years. It was supposed to be done in 2, and we've held them up for 8 years. And suddenly everybody in Europe is beginning to talk about CETA because my Prime Minister is probably coming over, is supposed to be coming over on October 27th, and he is going to sign with Joker an agreement to move ahead with CETA. Now, why this matters so much to you guys who are worried about American corporations and so on, although you should also be worried about Canadian corporations, is that American companies like Monsanto don't need TTIP, okay? Because there are 42,000 American companies operating in Canada, and they don't need TTIP. They can just sue you. They can just use the regulatory cooperation provision through CETA. So CETA is TTIP. I want people to please in the movements stop separating them. They're one and the same. CETA is the first of what you should just think of as free trade with the United States and North America in 2 parts. CETA is coming up immediately. Now what happened was the European Commission wanted to make it an unmixed agreement, which means that they would just sign and it would apply immediately. And even the Chancellor of Germany and the President of France, who both technically support CETA, said, no, we can't do that. It has to be a mixed agreement. That means it has to go to each legislature, each parliament to be ratified and debated, okay? Which is good, because it hasn't been debated in the European Parliament yet. I've just come from Denmark. It hasn't been debated there yet. It hasn't been debated anywhere. It's all been debated in Brussels, in Washington, Ottawa. So they won that. That was good. But then they said that we're going to have provisional application, and that means we'll go ahead and start it anyway. And then you can vote on it. Okay, now wait a minute. You're going to give with one hand and say we get to debate it and vote on it, but while we're debating and voting on it, you're going to go ahead and implement it. And that's the dispute right now. And we don't know what's going to happen. We're hearing that there's a real fight about if they're going to have provisional application, what will be in it. Will the investor state be in it? Will they take that out? But if you want a kind of hook right now, I think the process is so profoundly undemocratic that millions and millions of people have signed these signatures against CETA and TTIP, and yet they're just going to ram this thing through, and you're going to have no say, and it's going to go into effect before it comes to your parliament. It's absolutely wrong. So we're trying to build a movement from Canada and the United States to Europe. I shouldn't say trying, we are building a movement. Through environmental groups that we work with, both back in Canada and here, through the labor movement back in North America and here, through getting to students who care about the environment but maybe never put it together with these trade agreements before, to say these are not trade agreements. These are agreements about deregulation or about locking in deregulation. If you care about the environment and you worry about chemicals in our water, and you worry about water, and you worry about what we're doing to forests and the climate and the air and so on, then you need to know more about these trade agreements because they are incredibly important for you to understand. So I'm going to stop talking now and open this up for discussion, but I really want to urge you to urge your government here to slow down The world isn't going to come to an end on October 28th if they don't sign a piece of paper on October 27th, you know. You can say, most people don't know about it. This is brand new to us. You have not consulted. You know, the text itself wasn't public until just a year ago when they had an initial signing. We only found out what was in it through leaks, friendly people, friendly bureaucrats sending us information in brown paper bags. And I keep saying, if these agreements are so good, why aren't you proud of them? Why aren't you telling us what's in them? Why aren't you boasting about them? Why is it so secret? Why aren't you sending it to the legislatures and the parliaments and to be, you know, for you to be proud of? It's because they're corporate documents. They are corporate processes for transnational capital. And people need to stop just buying the rhetoric that all of these trade agreements are good, because not all trade agreements are good. So we are building this movement because we think we can come to agreements, trade agreements, that mean that we can grow food more sustainably and protect our environment and our water and our air, and transition over to better energy sources. But if big companies, the big fossil fuel companies, get locked into your country, you have to pay them for the right to do that. This isn't the way we move to a fossil-free future. So it's really important that we have this discussion and debate now. So those are my thoughts, and start with questions.
I think maybe you answered Margaret's question, but it was about how these agreements can wrap up the laws that we already have, or the standards that we already have. You said that our standards could be lowered, the ones we already have. And how is, because I see how they can like work for
Something higher.
Yeah, and how they can stop when we try to evolve our standards.
Yeah.
But how can they wrap up?
Yeah. So the question is, if you're allowed to have the standards when the company comes in, how is it that they force lower standards? They do it in these agreements. That's the regulatory cooperation part that I was talking about. So, and that's really dangerous because, okay, let's go back to Monsanto, because I think it's a really good example, because they're on record as saying they want these agreements to challenge the bans on GMOs in Europe. So they start a process. They go officially to the CETA or TTIP commission. There'll be a commission that gets set up between Europe and North America. And they say, we want to assert our right to have regulatory cooperation process started. And it's really regulatory convergence, because it's bringing the standards together. And then they set up a committee, and it's a cross-border committee. So it will be bureaucrats from Europe, bureaucrats from North America, people from Monsanto, trade experts, private sector advisors will all come together, and they'll sit on a panel negotiating team, and they'll take a couple of years, and they will come up with the new harmonized standards for North America and Europe. Now, they're not doing that to bring our standards in North America up to yours. They're not doing it for that reason. And they are going to put tremendous pressure on the governments, on the other government, through their own governments, to buy into the lower standards. And I'll give you an example. 2 examples already happen in TTIP and CETA aren't even in play. One is that last year, the European Commission was examining 13 controversial chemicals, and were preparing to ban them. And all of the environmental groups were saying ban them here in Europe. And they didn't. And they didn't because they were directly lobbied by the American government through TTIP, because these were all American companies, or chemicals from American companies. And they said it would be unfriendly and not helpful to be going into a TTIP negotiation with you doing that kind of thing. Why don't you just leave everything till TTIP is in play? That's an example. Second example is tar sands. I told you about our energy from Alberta. We don't want to send it to Europe. The companies want to send it to Europe because you have refineries here actually refine it, and it's really bad for the air and the water. So we're trying to stop the pipelines that would take it to port. So that's a big fight we have in Canada. And in Europe, you have something called the Fuel Quality Directive. And the Fuel Quality Directive is the ability that Europe retains, the European Parliament retains, to say we're going to look at the energy source of different energy being imported into Europe. And if there's a human rights implication in the country from which that energy source comes, or it's got higher CO2 emissions, or it's harming the water, or whatever, we're going to grade it lower than the energy coming from this country, where it's cleaner and paying the workers and so on. And so Europe was all ready to give our tar sands imports a negative listing, or a negative report. And our Prime Minister at the time, the last Prime Minister we had, Stephen Harper, actually got on a plane and came over to Europe and said, don't you dare do that, because we'll pull out steel tops if you do that. That's unfriendly. That's an unfriendly gesture to us if you do that. So it's, they use the pressure of the capital, and you've got to remember, these are companies that have very deep pockets. They have trade lawyers working for them. They're very wealthy. And they can afford to take lots and lots and lots of time to wear your governments down. And you've got to remember, it's already happening in Europe. Juncker, when he took over office, he said, I'm going to implement a cutting red tape program within Europe so that, it'll be easier for European companies to move from country to country, but the environmental groups that are watching it closely are saying it's all environmental rules that are being slashed. So already we're seeing that happening inside Europe. It's a pressure on all governments everywhere by big business. Just cut your rules. Our last government gutted every single one of our water laws protecting water in our country, every single one of them. And now the new government that says they want to reinstate them is really nervous because they could be challenged under NAFTA by American companies operating in Canada. But you don't have to change the rule to find that over time you gotta just wear you down and wear you down and wear you down. It's the purpose of these trade agreements.
If this commission has decided on new standards, we are obliged to accept them.
That's right. And it doesn't go to your parliament. It doesn't go to the European Parliament. It's part of the agreement, and these agreements supersede your own domestic laws. These are treaties. You have to understand. You guys are, some of you, I think, studying international law. These are international treaties. They're agreements that are very, very legally very binding. And so all your domestic law has to change to accommodate what the treaty says. So you lose a lot of sovereignty. The other issue that you lose, where you lose sovereignty, is in the legal community, because instead of your own courts hearing these disputes, it now goes to a panel of trade experts, who are mostly really rich trade lawyers who go around selling themselves to be put on these panels, right, because they make a fortune. And so it's basically an arbitration panel. So a very big transnational sues a country, comes in and sues Sweden and says, we feel we've been unfairly treated. Instead of it going to your court, where your court would say, go away, you don't have a case here. Or they might say you do have a case here, but they would look at it fairly and try to find a fair, is it right or wrong answer. It goes to an arbitration panel that's going to negotiate with the corporation. So you're going to end up paying something or giving up something, because it's a negotiating table. That's not a court. But you are giving away the right to deal with foreign capital. You're giving foreign corporations their own court, basically, or their own court system outside of your own. So you lose sovereignty in a whole bunch of ways under these agreements. Have I depressed you all totally? Yes.
Hello. My name is Ina, and I work for a Danish organization called Democracy in Europe, and I attended the conference that you were at in Denmark 2 days ago.
Oh, great, of course.
Yeah, And there you said also that that CETA is TTIP because Canadian companies are already established in Canada and they can sue Denmark, for example, to that agreement. And the Confederation of Danish Industries were also attending that conference.
Yes.
And they have since been saying that's not true. Because in order to use CETA to sue Europe, or companies, or can sue European government, then they will have to show that the investment is actually made from Canada and not from the US company. And that's their argument right now in Denmark. So I want to hear.
Yeah, well, they're wrong, and the proof is in the example I gave you about the moratorium on fracking in Quebec, that it's a Canadian company. The big company is in Canada, it's little subsidiaries of the United States, but the case went ahead from the little subsidiary in the United States. And we're probably going to lose. I mean, that's the case.
So there's no formal.
What it says, and this is, they consider this an improvement from NAFTA. Okay, what it says, and this is what the industry group is referring to, is that it has to be a legitimate financial operation in that country. In other words, it can't be what they call a post office subsidiary. But these companies are not post office subsidiaries. North America is an integrated economy. After NAFTA, and even before NAFTA, we are a branch plant economy in Canada. All of the big companies are operating. The big oil companies have been running our oil industry for 60, 70 years. They've been in Canada forever. They're huge. Monsanto is all over Western Canada. They have their canola and their corn and all of their Roundup Ready. We will not ban glyphosate, which is the Roundup Ready chemical, which is highly controversial, very controversial here in Europe and to be banned here, I believe. But we won't ban it because Monsanto is so powerful in the United States, or in North America. But they're just as much in Canada as they are in the United States now. So that's not true. And there was a very important report written by a group of legal scholars from the United States, a group called Public Citizen, and it's about this exact thing. They name the kind of companies and the rights that they would have through CETA. I mean, the industry group's going to tell you anything they need to tell you, and who's going to, and you believe it, I don't mean you, but one believes it, and then you'll find out. You'll find out how the tricks of the trade, they country hop. But they're saying that this provision of not being a post office box is going to make it, so it has to be real. But trust me, these companies are in Canada. We're often unhappy they're in Canada, but they're in Canada and they're here in the big way.
What is a positive argument for you to sell or have to promote this change?
Well, the positive argument is that it will create jobs and it will create a healthier economy. But again, I'll go back to my country. Because we're a big, vast country and we have lots of fish and trees and minerals and stuff, we were always trading resources. And we weren't building a secondary business or a secondary industry, so we decided in the 1960s and 70s, even the 50s, 60s and 70s of the last century, our former governments decided, let's start building a secondary manufacturing industry here in Canada. Because we want, why cut the trees down and ship them out? Why don't we build furniture with our trees and then sell the furniture? And that creates more jobs. So we got ourselves up to the point where, back when the first free trade agreement was being discussed in the early 80s, 26% of all of our jobs were in the GDP, were in manufacturing. Today it's 11%. All those jobs went, when the companies no longer had to keep a branch plant in Canada in order to be able to sell their wares tariff-free, they moved to Mexico. Now, I don't know, where the low-wage companies would go from here. I mean, you'd have to think it out. But if you've given up your right to give any rules to these companies, they can do what they want. And we had something called the Auto Pact. And the Auto Pact was a really good example of a good trade agreement. There's one of the good trade agreement. The big three automobile makers in the United States, and that's the only people who made cars in North America, we didn't make them in Canada, for years would sell cars in Canada, and we would put up quite high tariffs. They'd have to pay these tariffs in order to sell in our country. So they sat down with our government and they came up with a plan, a pact, an agreement, a trade agreement, that we would take down all those tariffs and they could sell all the cars they wanted, tariff-free, but they had to create employment in Canada. So they set up an auto parts industry around the Great Lakes area, in Windsor, and London, and Oshawa, Toronto, that created hundreds of thousands of high-paying jobs. They were unionized jobs, they were good jobs. They built whole communities on these good jobs. We were challenged under NAFTA and the WTO, the World Trade Organization, that this was no longer fair. We can't put these conditions on these companies. So the minute that we lost those cases, the companies just took the workers from North America. They were already shifting their workers out of Detroit, which is why Detroit is so devastated, moving them either to the low-wage states of the United States or to Mexico. Thousands and thousands of Canadian jobs moved over to Mexico. So we went from, what am I talking about, 80s, 90s, 30 to 40 years. We went from 26% of our GDP being manufacturing jobs to only 11%. And we're back shipping out our raw logs and shipping our fish away. And, and it creates the kind of jobs for most people that are what they call the precarious, much more precarious jobs. They go after the unions, they don't want unions, they don't want strong unions being able to say we want decent salaries and benefits and security for their old age for our workers. And the United States, they just continue to deunionize, and now we're seeing it in our country. When I see the unions here saying all these trade agreements are great, I just think, you don't know what's coming. You don't know what's coming and how it's going to hurt you. So the argument is always that it's good for jobs, and some trade agreements are, and that auto pact was a terrific job creating. So yes, the traditional trade agreements can be very good for certain things, but these are not traditional trade agreements.
So did you say that your Prime Minister's coming over to Sweden or to Europe to promote this?
He's coming to Brussels on October 27th, and they're going to have a formal signing of CETA.
So why does he support it?
Well, now, why does he support it? This is the question that keeps me up at night. We have a new Prime Minister. He's really cute. When he went to Singapore, the Singapore government put out a law or a rule saying that women reporters couldn't shoot. Seriously, I'm not making He's really cute. He's been on the cover of Gentleman's Quarterly, GQ, Gentleman's Quarterly, and he and his wife were posed looking in each other's eyes in Vogue magazine, and he's like, yeah. And he's lovely. He's lovely. We had a very right-wing, very conservative, really heated government that he replaced. And he's much better on issues of Indigenous people's rights, our First Nations. We have a lot of problems on our First Nations communities. He's better on gender issues, equality issues. He's just better, right? But he drank the Kool-Aid on these trade agreements. I bet my bottom dollar he's never read CETA. He has no idea what's in it. He doesn't have any idea what a investor state is. He just thinks free trade is good because he learned it in school. And just so think Obama, who is a lovely person, I like him myself, he's pro-free trade and he's never read these agreements. It's just, you learn when you go to certain business schools that it's just good for everybody. And it isn't, it's good for a certain elite. And so I think he's going to be sorely surprised when he understands the limits that these trade agreements are placing on his desire to truly deal with climate, because Canada every year at the annual United Nations Climate Summit was given the Doghouse Award or whatever it was called. Like every year we got the worst award for the worst country in the world. We were so embarrassed year after year. So this year our brand new government goes, and not only were they wonderful and saying all the right things, but instead of supporting the 2-degree ceiling on global warming, they went to the 1.5 degree, which was like radical, right? All the environmental groups were hopping up and down and excited. Canada supporting 1.5 degrees, blah, blah, blah. Then they go home and they're supporting the increase in the tar sands. Well, you can't do both. right? You can't have, there's no way you can support the tar sands growth and the oil industry and meet your climate summit agreement. So their job is going to be to just continue to make Canadians think that he's lovely, which he is, and not notice that in big things there's no difference between him and us. But it's a good question, why it doesn't bother governments that they're getting. I mean, why is Germany supporting ISDS, this investor state, when Vattenfall, your own company here, is suing them for phasing out nuclear? You'd think they would say, you don't want another investor state provision clause in the new agreement. Yes.
So I'm thinking, I'm really not so surprised that governments are sort of working for this because of the corporate influence of the governments in recent years. The question is sort of how can you sort of develop that kind of, or change that kind of balance? And I mean, you come from an organization called Council of Canadians, yes. Right? And that kind of, I'm thinking about the role of civil society organizations and kind of civic perspective in this. And I was thinking also when you were talking about the new sustainable development goals, the global goals, and how these things are related. So what do we need? Because these agreements are, as I'm thinking, maybe just a symptom. So okay, the agreements go away maybe if the debate goes in that direction. Still, probably there will be new attempts. So there's something down below that we need to, some kind of foundations or an ongoing discourse that we need to challenge. And I think you were touching upon it when you were talking about this argument about jobs, which is a very simple argument to say, okay, this will create jobs, and let's do it. No matter the effects on the environment, on democracy, whatever, it creates jobs. So then we can do anything. And I think that kind of discussion is changing, because we also know that we have the more automation of industry, etc., will not only challenge the sort of very simple jobs, but also much more advanced jobs. So things are changing when it comes to jobs. So I think there is a need for kind of deeper discussion here. And so I'm thinking, what do you think about the role of civil society and the kind of public debate in these matters to challenge this?
Well, wonderful, wonderful question/statement, because I totally agree with you that trade is only a piece of it. But it's a very important piece of it because it's the legal framework for it. And it makes it much harder to have the debate and discussion you're talking about once these free trade agreements are in place. And by the way, with the development goals, UN development goals, they're voluntary. I mean, all the countries sign them, and the UN General Assembly adopts them. But there's no army that's going to come in and make you do them. Whereas, in these trade agreements, you pay a penalty if you don't obey the trade agreement. So the trade agreement, trade and investment agreements, are the only international treaties that are really enforceable. And there's something really wrong with that. I mean, really, if you stop and think about it, all the human rights treaties and agreements we sign at the UN, treaties on climate, we go to the climate summit every year, it's all voluntary. It's all your word. It's ethical. You said you're going to do this. Nobody can make you do it. But in a trade and investment agreement, you will pay if you change the rules. So I just want to leave that. I want you to have that thought in your mind, especially those of you studying international laws. We think of them as equal. There's these environmental and human rights labor agreements, the ILO over here, and then there's trade agreements, and they balance each other. Not at all. On your question of civil society, it's incredibly important. Our organization got started 31 years ago to fight the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement and then NAFTA. And then since then, we've been fighting a lot of the negative implications or effects of economic globalization. So we're fighting to maintain our public health care system in our country. Here we are in a place that has public health care. Excuse me, I just came from Denmark that has public health care, but the right wing in our country says only Canada and Cuba still have socialistic health care. It just makes you crazy. They just lie. They just say what they want. They're the big private healthcare companies build HMOs like in the US. We have a campaign to keep that. We've got a campaign on climate trying to stop our expansion of our tar sands and the pipelines and so on. I do a lot of work on the human right to water. I was very involved in getting the UN to recognize the human right to water, and that was a global civil society movement that came together and just said to the UN, stop dilly-dallying, stop putting it off. It's appalling that, you know, it's the biggest killer of children in the world, dirty water. It's more than all forms of violence, including war, together. It took a huge amount of work to get that. There's a huge climate movement, Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth and 350.org and so on. We're part of that from our country. So I'm deeply involved and deeply believe that civil society plays a huge role in transforming values and asserting the values that I actually think are the dominant values in our societies. And that's why I'm saying to those movements and students who care, do your trade homework. You can't do that other stuff and just say, oh, the trade has nothing to do with me. You have to know how these deals are what's the word? Lowering the space or decreasing the space in which you can operate.
One thing that I'm thinking about when it comes to civil society organizations that are part of this discussion on sustainability, that maybe, I mean, the problem maybe for some of the organizations to take a position in the debate is also the fact that, like governments and businesses are saying that, well, we are the positive force. We are saying, yes, we are creating jobs. And these organizations that are fighting, they are just saying no. So many of the civic movements tend to focus on stopping things. And do you think it's possible to turn that around? And that would have a kind of a bearing on what's happening?
Yeah, I think our movements are also working to promote alternatives, and that includes alternative forms of jobs. There's a lot of work being done on what they call a labor environmental alliance, red-green alliance kind of thing. Certainly I know in North America there's a lot of work being done between labor groups and environmental groups on alternative energy, because we know that alternative energy creates more jobs than fossil fuels, more permanent jobs, more community jobs such as retrofitting buildings and all the ways in which we know we can conserve energy and we don't need to use as much fossil fuel. And you guys have done much better on that in Europe than we have in North America. So I would say there's a lot of work around protecting public services as public services and keeping those good jobs. As the population ages, they need more services and those should not be privatized, and therefore that's one other way to ensure jobs. So, and local economic development is huge. There are movements all over the world locally to promote local businesses, local small farms and that kind of thing. And again, you run into trouble if government supports that. They're not going to tell you not to do it, but if they do anything to support or to subsidize it, then they get into trouble with these trade agreements. But yeah, I would say our movement is actually working very strongly to have alternative visions for our movement. I know when you fly over from Canada, you sit on a plane, you make your voice really dry, so just to know my cough. Yes.
I have one more question about this 27th. Is that the date when they will maybe agree to use it, even if it's not ratified?
No, so what that is, the signing on the 27th of October, if it happens, it's still, I mean, now we're hearing, maybe not. If it happens, it's a formal signing between Canada and Europe that CETA is to move to the next stage. And the next stage is that it goes to the European Parliament. So we've been working really hard at the European Parliament to get them to say no to it. If the European Parliament says yes, and it's coming with a provisional application, then it goes into effect probably, I would say, spring of 2017. And then the process starts where it comes to your own individual legislatures. So we're working at different levels. We're trying to stop the process from going, we don't want that signing, but it's not all that important. It's really the vote in the European Parliament that's important.
But you also said that trade will maybe implemented before.
No, before it goes to your parliaments, but after it goes to the European Parliament. So first of all, there's the signing, and that really is symbolically important. Then it goes to the European Parliament, either later in 2016 or early 2017. If it's adopted there, then its provisional application will apply and it'll go into effect immediately. As you're debating it in the parliaments, it will already be, but it'll be after it goes to the parliament.
I'm still stuck with the fact that you were talking about the case with Nicaragua and the amount of money that they had to pay back, and then thinking of the Sustainable Development Goals and how we could set up this goals long term of making the world a better place and all this. What possibilities have developing countries to fight back or to say, you know what, this agreement is not doing anything for us, we're done with it? Like, can you say no? Is there a possibility? What can they get together? Now, there's a lot in Latin America. There's a lot of organizations between states and governments that are fighting certain things. It's more against the states a lot more. I haven't heard that much against Canada. But what possibilities do they have if they hopefully have any to say, I don't like this, I want to change it?
The very important point. A number of countries in Latin America have already said no to ISDS. Bolivia said no. Nicaragua has said no more future agreements like this. Brazil has never adopted ISDS. Brazil will not sign one trade agreement that has investor state in it. Australia banned investor state under the last government. The new government is a little more conservative, and they said, well, we'll look at it on a case-by-case basis, but there's still real concern. India has just announced it's not going to sign any more trade agreements with ISDS in it. There's a real movement. And looking back to the point about civil society, if we can build a civil society movement against ISDS, at the very least, at least take that out of these agreements, I think we're going to find a bunch of governments beginning to be very willing. In fact, my guess is my government, my new government, would be willing to reopen CETA. The old government would not, but my guess is if we could show them that it would be more popular in Europe with the very people that they want to be friends with, people in the labor movement and environment movement and so on, human rights, because that's how my government identifies. I think if they could show that, my guess is they would reopen it. So there's a whole movement now to reform CETA, and if TTIP ever comes along, to reform TTIP. So I just feel, I'm of an age and I've watched change over my lifetime. The year my mother was born, the Canada Elections Act said no woman, idiot, lunatic, or child shall vote. I mean, really, So in the lifetime of my mother, it's not that long, really, and if you look back at history, we went from women being considered lunatics and idiots, right, to over half the women coming out of law school and medical school in our country are women, So I've watched change over my life. I've watched the change in attitudes around gays and lesbians and around everything. I mean, diversity. We've profoundly changed. We can change. And I think as people, the problem with these trade agreements is they're complicated. And a lot of people say, I'm doing my thing here, and it's too complicated. And the government says it's okay. And so they don't dig into it, and when folks like this start to dig into it and they find out what's in it, then they start to get active. So I'm seeing a movement, certainly around Europe, and on the 17th of this month, there's going to be rallies all over Europe against CETA, and it would be really good for you guys to come out and be part of it. There's going to be one here in Malmo. They're going to be huge in Germany. It started in Germany. They had an anti-TTIP, anti-CETA march a year and a half ago in Berlin that was 250,000 people about a trade agreement that's so, thousands of pages long. So when people get learning about this stuff and they get literate about these issues, and then they get passionate and then they do something. But I really think there's a movement. I honestly think these trade agreements are the last vestige of the dinosaurs of these big companies. I think they're going to implode. We're going to move to much more sustainable Food production, we have to. The world's running out of water. You get me started on water and I won't stop, right? But that's my big passion, is water. But we are a planet in crisis. Our planet is in crisis, and I don't mean just countries like India, which you might expect, but countries like Brazil, which had water and cut down so much of the Amazon that the vapor it gave off used to create what they call flying rivers. That is airborne currents of rain, basically, that would come down and rain every year. You count on almost the day it started in Sao Paulo. Well, they cut down so much of the Amazon, it's not happening anymore. And they don't know where they're going to get water for the 20 million people that live in the Sao Paulo area. For instance, my country, I just wrote a book, it's coming out next week when I go home, on Canada's water crisis. You think Canada, you think water? We have a crisis. So we can't continue. I mean, if we don't do it now, we'll do it in a few years when it's too late. And maybe not too late, but we will be forced to say, we can't keep guzzling water. We can't keep pumping up groundwater and growing food in the way we do. We can't, it's not, the Ogallala Aquifer just came out in a report from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which produces most of the food outside of California for all of the United States and tons of export. The Ogallala Aquifer, which is once as big as Lake Huron, an underground aquifer, will be gone in our lifetime. You know, when you understand what we're dealing with, that this is gone, as in never to come back, you have to change the way we grow food. You have to change the way we mine minerals and produce energy, because the planet can't sustain what we're doing. And these trade agreements are based on a model of unlimited growth. There's no end to the forest. There's no end to the wetlands. There's tons of water. Don't you worry about it. Well, there isn't any of that left. I mean, it's just not true. And when you understand that, then you look at the big picture and the values and the model, not just in the trade agreements, but this notion of unlimited growth, which most governments subscribe to. You have to have 3% growth or 4%, and China's got what growth? You don't know if it's true, and China says it's got 11% growth or whatever. They're slowing down because they're running out of water. Since 1990, are you ready for this? Half the major rivers, over half the major rivers in China have disappeared. They're gone. They don't know where they went. They're just gone. Well, I know where they went. They went to produce hydroelectricity for coal, because they're big time into coal. But they also produce, you know, half the world's running shoes and teddy bears and pillows and stuff, exported all over the world. You're exporting water. When everything that you make that uses water, all the food you make, all the food we produce, if you produce cattle and you ship it away, you're shipping away your water, because it takes an enormous amount of water to produce cattle. I mean, if you sit down to a family of 4 sits down to a small steak each, you're drinking the equivalent of an Olympic-sized swimming pool. That's what your 4 steaks, that's how much water it took to make your 4 steaks. An Olympic-sized swimming pool of water. And so when we start to understand that there are limits, the Earth has limits, we'll have to adapt. Or people will die, and people, you know, are already dying in some places of these very issues.
You're saying that maybe your government could be convinced to go back to the drawing board and make a better deal. And you said on Wednesday that there are a lot of people in Canada who think that if they make a deal with Europe, who has higher standards, then their standards will go up as well. My question is that even possible under NAFTA? If you think about the possibility, would it be possible to do that?
A lot of us would still like to get out of NAFTA, and it has a 6-month clause to get out, whereas CETA is years, you know, so it's much longer commitment. Yeah, in Canada, it's been hard to get the issue of CETA going, because everybody has this image that Europe is cool. And people here, if you know about Canada, you have the image that Canada is cool. You don't know how we've changed our standards, and I don't think people at home know about austerity here, or, you know, there have been big changes, or how high unemployment for youth is in some of the countries, you know, Greece and Spain and so on. So the issues, we have problems on both sides of the ocean. We need to come up with a better agreement. But I do believe my current government would be open to it. I think they want to be liked, and they don't want people, we're the target that they want, people who are progressive and thoughtful and care about the environment and care about human rights. And I think if they could be convinced that they could get a deal that would be better on those fronts, I think they would be open. Really
But would it be possible to do that and still have NAFTA?
Well, we'd still be stuck with NAFTA.
But couldn't then American companies challenge you on the NAFTA for raising your standards?
Oh yeah.
On the CETA?
Oh yeah, we're cooked. But we just don't want more corporations from Europe to have the same rights that the NAFTA corporations. Oh yeah, no, we've suffered under NAFTA. There's no question about it. We'd have to get out of NAFTA. We'd have to, but as I say, I think this movement against ISDS is really growing. We need to convince governments that it should not be part of trade agreements. So what we're hoping is that within 10 years, ISDS will be out of all trade agreements. That's my hope, is that we can build that kind of a movement. Yeah, no, we're still stuck with NAFTA for a while. Sure? And we'll not come up.
But do you think that CETA could be
Renegotiated?
renegotiated to include trade agreements?
It would have to be so changed from my perspective. It would just have to be basically a trade agreement around taking down some tariffs and opening up borders and giving what's called national treatment to each other's companies, which means they can come in and trade and you can't discriminate against them, but you don't have to pay them for the right to regulate. So I would say at the very least you'd have to take out the ISDS clause, the regulatory cooperation clause, the local procurement that stops local economic development, and the standstill and ratchet clauses which prevent you from going back to a public system once you privatize. To my mind, those four have to be fundamental. And then I think they should agree to incorporate in the agreement the ILO standards, which they refer to, but it's not in the body of the agreement. So there's some things to take out and some things that they could add, and the right to regulate would have to be in there in a way that is not coded by or codified by, but it has to be trade friendly. So there are certain things that, not just ISDS for my own, but there's a real movement and people know about these things. And there's going to be you watch the march on the 17th. I don't know how big it will be here. It's going to be huge in some countries in Europe. And they're listening. The politicians know that this is going on. Yes.
Yeah, talking about this march, I'm interested in how do you actually mobilize people and inform them, because until coming here, I feel that it's a very important issue, but until coming here, I have not seen anywhere. So I'm just also interested if you use ICTs and media, like social media, to spread the message, since I guess that most of the people, at least here among my friends, are really not informed about it, and probably will join.
Well, what I'm going to do is stop talking because my voice is going. And I'm going to ask Ellie to answer that question and talk about the march here and the demonstration. And just to thank you all very much. I mean, it's a real delight to sort of turn some light bulbs on in people's heads. And just, you are the future. Like, you guys you'll build the world that your kids can live in. And we need you to build the right world. We'll work with you. It's not that we're handing it over to you, but it's really important to go deeper into these questions. So I thank you all very much. It's just been a real pleasure and honor to be here.
Well, just some closing remarks and to answer the question about the mobilization for the 17th. We are working on social media. I think it's typical for the Swedish climate, the debate climate, that you don't see anything out of it. Because we're rather small groups. Friends of the Earth Sweden is not a really large group. Greenpeace is getting into the campaign a little bit. The Swedish Society for Nature Conservation is also steaming up, but it's going really slow. And also the big difference, I think, between Germany and Sweden are the trade unions. I mean, the trade unions in Germany are against TTIP, and in Sweden they try to shove it underneath the carpet, basically. So they say trade is good, and now we don't want to talk about it very much. So that makes a big difference. I mean, unions have the possibility to reach out to their membership, reach out to the media, etc. It would make a big difference if they would join our side of the battle. And I think we've heard from Maud that the arguments are there. They shouldn't join our side. So that's a bit of the situation in Sweden. We have a Swedish organization called Stoppa TTIP Sverige, Stop TTIP in Sweden, and we're also focusing on CETA, of course, now. So it is there. So you can find it on Facebook. You can find it on the internet.
Is my paper on that site? Doing my report on CETA?
Probably not yet. No.
Okay, because that would be a good thing. I wrote a report called CETA, TTIP, ISDS, Lessons from Canada, which has a lot of what I just said in it. It's in a bunch of languages. It's not yet in Swedish, it's in Danish, but we probably should find somebody to get it translated. But whatever your list, German, it's in Spanish, it's in French, and a bunch of Polish, I think Italian. But it'll give you good background if you want to read more, and it's really readable. I wrote it to be accessible. So maybe if you could put it up on that site, people can access it.
I just had a quick look at signing up to the Friends Day thing. Can we sign up if we're not Swedish nationals?
Yeah, you can sign up, and we'll think later how to deal with that. I mean, for instance, we have a group here in Malmö that's working on against TTIP, is going to organize the demonstration, and we are mostly Swedish speaking, but we speak English as well, so it would be so. So, or also if you want to have a Malmö Högskola group against it, would be an option. So yeah, please sign up and we'll get back to you and welcome you to our meetings, etc. The info material that you find here is also in Swedish, unfortunately. How many people speak Swedish here? A couple. Okay, great.
We could also arrange some, I think Greenpeace has some material in English.
Maybe we could organize to come to Malmö Högskola at one point the next couple of weeks to have English material and maybe talk a little bit more about mobilization. So yeah, if you have any Swedish friends though, you can pick the material and give to your friends as well.
And please take like flyers, and we have posters for the manifestation on 17th.
So, and of course come to Gustav Adolfs Torg, 1 o'clock on Saturday, the September 17th. So that's about 1 week from now. So that's final remark. I have a little bit of a present for you all. It's sort of symbolic, I think. It turned out to be symbolic and chocolate. It's Belgian fair trade chocolate.
Nice.
First of all, you could say Belgium, Brussels is the center of negotiations for this horrible topic. And of course, the chocolate is fair trade, not the free trade that is promoted by everyone.
Well, we thank you so much.
So, thank you very much, and hope to see you again, and hope that you feel that you have more information, can make more informed decisions, and that we can have a better discussion about these issues. Thank you very much for your